Over the weekend, one of the participants in my sourdough starter workshop mentioned that she wants to live a more homesteadish lifestyle, but she feels like she can't because she lives in a neighborhood with an HOA. This topic has been on the forefront of my mind as I've been building my own suburban homesteadish life, and I want to share some tips with you today. Along the way, I will share my 2024 spring garden update, some sourdough technique tips, and an easy 15-minute homemade sloppy joe recipe. It seems too simple to be true, but one of the easiest ways to incorporate a homestead-like lifestyle into your suburban life is to purchase produce and plants and goods from your local farmers and farmers markets. I got these amazing onions at a local produce stand. They're strawberry onions. So they are grown in strawberry fields. They don't taste like strawberries, but they're really, really mild. And they're grown with the strawberries as a companion plant. So that way it can create the right balance of nutrients. But even though I'll be trying to grow my own onions this year, I do like to go to my local farmers markets and purchase things that I can't do right now or I can't do at all, because not only does it help me create the life I want, but it also provides income and resources for my local community. So purchasing from others locally is a great way to get started with a scratch-made homestead-ish like lifestyle. But I am expanding my garden this year, and as you can see, it is finally almost finished. We just have cleanup and a few finishing touches. We added a greenhouse, and then we also tripled the size of our raised beds. If you've been watching for the last few weeks, maybe month or so, you have been following the life cycle of these seedlings, and they are doing great, especially now that I got them out of my guest room closet and into the greenhouse. Now, the greenhouse is functional. It's usable. At the time of filming this, the shelves were not in yet. They actually are now, but while I was repotting these, I had to sit on the floor. But it is a usable, functional greenhouse that is home to my seedlings as they harden and wait to be transplanted into our new raised beds. In a video a few weeks ago, I fertilized my seedlings with fish emulsion, and that really helped revive them because they needed those nutrients. But now that they're in the greenhouse, they're doing great, and especially because they're in bigger pots. So definitely, if your seedlings are starting to struggle, it is a good time maybe to repot them, give them a little bit of fertilizer, and if the weather is appropriate in your area, start getting those babies some sunshine. Some of my seedlings ended up a little bit leggy, but I'm gonna roll with it and we'll just see how it goes. I watch a lot of homestead YouTube channels, and they're full of inspiration and great ideas, and I totally recommend that you watch them and take some good tips from them. But the reality is, for most of us who live in the suburbs, for example, that life is not replicable. So using the space reasonably that I have, and then what I can't grow, I like to buy from local farmers and farmers markets if I can. The green stalks really help me save on space because they grow up, not out. In the one in the back, I am growing all peas for now, and the one in the front, I'm doing all cilantro that I'm hoping to freeze dry later. In the past, I haven't bothered with getting my soil tested, but I think that was a mistake. So this year, I am getting my soil tested through our local cooperative extension because it is free. So definitely check your local cooperative extension to see if they do free or cheap soil testing so you can get started on the right foot this year. But not everything on the Suburban Homestead takes place outside. There's a lot happening inside too. So I have been looking for some just plain old clear glass bowls for a long time. And I see people all the time on YouTube find these sorts of things at like antique shops and thrift stores, and they're so pretty. But honestly, the thrill of the hunt is just not for me. It creates a lot of anxiety. So I found these at Target. The large bowl is the perfect size for making 2 loaves of sourdough. Now, the day that this video is coming out is the official National Sourdough Day. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know who made that up, but hey, happy National Sourdough Day. So I wanted to share with you a few tips and techniques about sourdough because making scratch-made food, and I feel like especially bread, is where a lot of folks want to start when incorporating more homestead-ish practices into their homes. I have a lot of sourdough resources on YouTube and on my website at moonandmagnolia.com. So I will link some of those in the description box below, including a link to my free sourdough starter ebook and some YouTube videos about how to make a sourdough starter and how to make a no-knead classic rustic loaf of sourdough bread. One of the questions I receive the most is, how do I create more sourdough starter? And you might want to do that if you want to make more bread, or if you want to make more discard recipes, or like someone in my sourdough workshop said the other day, if you want to sell sourdough starter on Etsy, for example. It's pretty hard to feed a starter too much. So one way to bulk up your starter is to just double how much you're regularly feeding it. So that would be a 1-part starter, 2-part flour, 2-part water ratio. So just keeping the math really simple, let's say you have 10 grams of starter in your jar. You would then give that 10 grams of starter 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of water. And you can continue that ratio for as many feedings as you need until you have as much starter as you want. Not only is that useful for bulking up your starter, but it's actually pretty good to do for the health of your starter every once in a while. Starter tends to get acidic over time, so giving it that 1-to-2 ratio can help reduce the acidity and get your starter back to a normal balance. So even if you're not trying to bulk up your starter, I recommend doing that. Now, I do this for my sourdough starter workshops. We do practice feedings in my workshop. So what I like to do to bulk up my starter is I just discard less, and then I feed it that 1-to-2 ratio. And I do that as much as I need to until I have enough practice starter for feedings in my workshops. That's what these little jars are. Those are practice feedings. But I have sold out my workshop 4 times now. And what's so interesting is how many people in those workshops tell me that they are taking the class because they want to not just incorporate scratch-made cooking into their lifestyle, but also more homestead practices. Now, we all live in a suburban town. We live on the coast, just a couple miles from the beach, and there are not a lot of spaces here for a homestead or a farm. On the outskirts of town, there are, but honestly, where we are, everyone I know coming to these workshops, we all live in the suburbs with an HOA. It's just really interesting and kind of fascinating to me how many people want to do this right now. Now, the other thing I want to show you is stretch and fold techniques. So stretch and folds are a great mystery sometimes, but the thing I really want to emphasize is when you are stretch and folding your sourdough, stretch and fold it as many times as you need to until it starts to give you resistance. So you can see in the beginning, my sourdough was really stretchy, and now it's starting to get a little harder to stretch. When it has that resistance and it's harder to stretch, that means it needs to rest for a little bit. So in my very first cycle of stretch and folds, I sometimes do between 8 and 10 stretch and folds. And on my last cycle, as you can see here, it is stretchy, but I can only get like 3 or 4 stretch and folds before it gives me resistance. And that is good. And that is what we want. So what I want to emphasize is that when you're reading a sourdough recipe, whether it's mine or someone else's, and they give you a specific number of stretch and folds, that is a helpful place to get started. But really, the most important thing you can do when learning how to make sourdough bread is understand the dough. So when it gives you that resistance, stop, let it rest, and then come back and do your next cycle of stretch and folds. Whether you're making bread or starting a garden, learning how to preserve food, there is a whole period that really, I don't think it ever ends, of trial and error, of seeing what works and seeing what doesn't, and trying different techniques and what works for you. If it is worth trying, it is worth failing. So get your gardens going. If everything dies, it's okay. You'll do better next year. Work on your bread, and if it falls flat or doesn't rise or whatever, if it's gummy or dense in the middle, it's okay. Just make more next time. Of course, if you're living in the suburbs, there is a lot of control about what you can and can't do on the outside of your house on your property, but no one can stop you from what you make inside your kitchen. And one of the tenets of homestead-ish lifestyle is scratch-made cooking. And if you made it this far in this video and you're like, I want to live the homesteadish lifestyle, but I'm not gardening, I'm not making bread, you still have to eat, right? So scratch-made food is a great place to start if there's nothing else that you want to do when it comes to a suburban homesteadish lifestyle. For dinner, I am making some roasted vegetables with compound butter from my garden. That is unsalted butter with garlic chives and a little bit of salt. Those garlic chives are from last year's herb garden, and herb gardens are a great way to garden in the suburbs because they don't take much space. They are really easy to preserve in butter or freeze, so it's a great way to get started. So I simply just chopped everything up. I melted the butter and I'm pouring it over, and I'm putting everything on a preheated stone. When I roast vegetables, I like to get the baking sheet, or in this case, the stone, nice and hot before I put the vegetables on because that helps crisp them up, and they're really good that way. And then about halfway through, 10 minutes or so, I'm taking them out and giving them a stir and putting them back in the oven so they cook evenly. I shared a chicken sheet pan meal in a video recently. I'll leave that in the description box below, but it was delicious and it's really similar to this, but instead of making this a sheet pan meal, I am making this with homemade sloppy joes on homemade sourdough buns. I feel like often when we're talking about scratch cooking, things seem complicated because there's a lot of talk about, say, sourdough and stretch and folds, for example. And I do like to experiment with technique in those things, but when it comes to actual cooking, like dinner, I want things to be really easy. Because if it's not easy, I can't do all the other things that I want to do, like make sourdough and be in the garden. And these homemade sloppy joes, they take between 15 and 20 minutes to get on the table. Of course, the homemade sourdough buns took more time, but I actually made those a few days before, so these were leftovers. So you could use any leftover buns that you have or store-bought if that's what you have too. So in my cast iron skillet, I just sauteed some onion and now I'm adding in ground beef and giving it a stir. Of course, adding a little salt and pepper along the way to season it. And then just before I start adding in the saucy ingredients, I am mincing some garlic right into the pan. I say this all the time, don't overcook your garlic, it'll make it terrible. Now, the sloppy joe sauce is so easy. It is 1 cup of ketchup and then add in some water. When I was looking at recipes for sloppy joes and recipe testing this, I kept seeing people adding in water and it seemed redundant because I already had these saucy ingredients like yellow mustard that I'm adding in now and of course the ketchup. But actually the water really helps not only combine the ingredients, but it gives it that classic sloppy joe texture. So then I'm also adding in a spoonful of brown sugar, a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, which I think I said incorrectly, but you know what I mean, and then a little bit of chili powder too. And then I'm simply stirring this up and letting it cook until the sauce reaches the desired consistency. You can get this full recipe with precise measurements in the description box below and on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. But let's talk about these sourdough hamburger buns. So I have been experimenting a lot with tongjiang, or what is also known as Japanese milk bread, and I have been recipe testing and working on milk bread hamburger buns. I have some kinks to work out with these, so the recipe will be available soon, but these were still very good. But at this point, they were a couple days old and I wanted them to be softer and taste a little bit more fresh for the sloppy joes. So I sliced these in half and then I steamed them. I don't have a basket steamer, so I just put an inch or two of water in a stock pot and then I put my sieve over that. And then I put the buns right into the sieve with a lid and let them steam for a few minutes. And surprisingly, they took a little longer to steam than what I was anticipating. I thought it would happen a lot faster, but they did sit in there for a couple of minutes. But this was really good. So if you have a little bit of stale sourdough bread or some store-bought bread that just needs a little refresh, this was a great method. You could totally wrap it in a wet paper towel and put it in the microwave, but this was a lot better. Then I just spooned some of the sloppy joe mixture right onto the sourdough bun and topped it and served it with a side of those delicious roasted vegetables. And this was such an easy meal, scratch made from head to toe without any real extra work. Again, those buns, they were from a few days ago, so I didn't have to worry about it. And the sloppy joes, depending on how long it takes your beef to cook, they'll be ready in 15 to 20 minutes. So this was a great scratch made meal. Okay, we need to get back to that bread. So now the bread has proofed, and you can see through this nice clear bowl that it's nice and bubbly. And when you shake the bowl, you'll know that that dough is ready when it jiggles. So if it has a little jiggle to it, it has proofed enough. That's one way to tell. There are a lot of different ways to tell, but that has been a pretty effective method for me. So now I am just turning out the dough onto the counter and splitting it in two because I am making 2 bowls of sourdough. Now, none of this is really new to my YouTube channel. You've probably seen me do this a number of times if you have watched my channel, except I am experimenting with some new shaping techniques. So I've seen people take their dough, stretch it into a little rectangle, and then fold it over and then shape their dough into a ball. I tried this. I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure if it really did anything fancy or special. My bread seemed to be just like my bread any other way that I've shaped it before. I mean, I don't know. It's possible I didn't do something right, but it didn't seem to do too much. But I encourage you to continue experimenting. And that's part of the spirit of all of this when it comes to gardening and what you want to preserve and the things that you want to make is seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and sticking with what does work for you. I used to be a full-time yoga teacher, and this yoga teacher that I studied with one time, he always said, try this, try that, see what works. And that is true for just about everything, including your homestead-ish lifestyle. try this, try that, see what works. Now, this is also a new technique that I am trying. This is called stitching your bread. It's where you take the bread and pull from opposite ends and pinch it together for your final shaping. Now, this I actually felt like did help, but usually what I do is I just sort of fold the ends in toward the middle and pinch them closed, but this worked better and I felt like my bread held up better after the cold proofing. Sometimes the way I used to do it or the way I usually do it, the bread kind of separates while it's cold proofing, but the stitching actually worked pretty well. So I do recommend giving that a try if you haven't already. When you're incorporating a new lifestyle, or if you're experimenting with something new, if you're trying new things, you will probably have to ride the wave of the good, the bad, and the ugly, because some things are going to work and some things aren't, and that's just part of it. But I do like to throw in some easy wins to my days, most days if I can. And one thing that I like to do is work on my bread art. Now, I have been practicing with others scoring. I haven't really shared it on YouTube because sometimes it's like not pretty, but I do make design and sell bread art stencils on my site at moonandmagnolia.com. I bake mine for 25 minutes with the lid on the Dutch oven at 500 degrees, and then I take the lid off and I bake it again for about 10 minutes. So the first 25 minutes creates oven spring, the second time without the lid creates the nice brown crust, and you have a beautiful loaf of sourdough. I truly believe that no matter where you live, you can have the life you want, as long as you're willing to expand beyond your perceived limitations and work within the real ones like an HOA. You too can live a homesteadish lifestyle no matter where you are.